Welcome to this YouTube channel. Today we are going to discuss modern synthetic theory of evolution, in which we are going to deal with forces of evolution. This video lesson is developed in three parts: part 1, part 2, part 3. And in part 1 we are going to discuss only the two forces of evolution, that is the mutation and the gene flow. Let's get started. Contents of this entire video lesson. As I mentioned, it is developed in three parts. Part 1 consists of introduction, mutation, gene flow. Part 2 is consisting of genetic drift, subheadings founder effect, bottleneck effect. And part 3 of this video lesson will discuss natural selection and different scientific procedures of natural selection. They are the stabilizing selection or normalizing selection, the directional selection, and the disruptive selection. So today, now we are going to deal with part 1. Modern synthetic theory explains the correct way of evolution procedure. The mechanism of evolution occurs by small genetic changes. Evolution doesn't actually occur as Lamarck mentioned, or as Darwin considered, that the individual effort will bring evolution in the entire population. So that may not be the correct one actually to understand. So all the ideas of Charles Darwin, Gregor Johann Mendel, and certain other scientists are mingled to cook or to prepare a theory of evolution, and that is known as modern synthetic theory. Weismann's germplasm theory explains that somatic variation never be inherited. So, in whichever theory the importance is given to somatic variations, that theory is simply discarded. Only the germplasm variation, germline variations are considered because they are playing very important role in the process of evolution and in the mechanism of evolution. Hugo de Vries explained about mutations, and he proposed mutation theory. So mutations are actually causing variations. Friends, you know very well that the very fundamental or the very important criticism on Darwinism is that Darwin explained survival of the fittest but not arrival of the fittest. How the variations are arrived, Darwin did not explain. But Hugo de Vries explains that variations occur because of mutations. So instead of variations, we use the word mutation. And Darwin explained about inheritance in a wrong way. So let us add Mendelian laws of inheritance. So Weismann germplasm theory, Hugo de Vries mutation theory, Mendel laws, in combination with Darwinism, helped us in understanding a lot about the mechanism of organic evolution. So organic evolution does not occur only because of natural selection. There are certain forces that are driving the species towards a particular evolutionary change. So there are certain forces that are driving. Huxley, Haeckel, Simpson, Fisher, Sewall-Wright, and Mayer, these are all neo-Darwinists, proposed the idea of modern synthetic theory, which is also known as genetic theory of evolution or simply neo-Darwinism. So Darwin explained the very important idea of natural selection, but the scientific way of natural selection was explained in this theory. Not only the natural selection as the main force of evolution, there are several other forces that are favoring evolutionary process. We are going to discuss all of these forces in modern synthetic theory. Huxley for the first time used the phrase called the modern synthesis. Modern synthesis explains that the entire evolutionary theory is actually synthesized from the ideas of several scientists like Mendelian inheritance and Hugo de Vries mutations and Charles Darwin natural selection and Sewall Wright what is that called genetic drift and all these ideas. Ronald Fisher developed the required mathematical language in his uh, in his book called The Genetic Theory of Natural Selection. How to understand the process of evolution in mathematical expressions in the form of allelic frequencies. So Ronald Fisher did a very good work in understanding evolution in terms of mathematics. JBS Halden introduced the concept of cost of natural selection. Natural selection is a very, very important driving force of evolution. So he explained about the cost of natural selection. Sewall Wright elucidated the natural selection and adaptation in his Genetics and Origin of Species in the year 1937. Natural selection and adaptation. Okay, what is the role of adaptation of an animal in natural selection? How natural selection affects the several adaptations. So these are all the ideas. Dubzhansky, Dubzhansky, Theodor Dubzhansky established the ideas, established a very important idea that mutations once seen as a rival of selection. You see, Darwinism. In Darwinism, simply Darwin discarded the sports of nature. Sports of nature are actually the mutations. Darwin thought that they have no importance in evolution at all. So they are considered as the rival of evolution. Okay, they are the rival to selection because nature will not select such a big variation. Okay, so these sports or the mutations once seen as a rival to selection, but actually now they are the supplying raw materials for evolution and they are creating diversity. I read, mutations once seen as a rival to selection actually supplied the raw materials for natural selection by creating diversity. This is a phrase given by Dubzhansky. Once mutations were totally discarded, but now they are taken because they are the actual material. They are the actual things, raw materials for creating new variations. Malthusian competition. Actually, Darwin was influenced by Malthusian philosophy. Malthusian competition, mutations, and Mendelian inheritance with some other ideas like genetic drift by chance all together resulted modern synthetic theory. So modern synthetic theory explains the actual process of evolution which occurs by small genetic changes, and these genetic changes occur as variations because of mutations, and those mutations which are favoring or which are having the adaptive value are selected by natural selection. Not only the nature that is causing evolution, but also other forces are there. Such forces may be gene flow or some other we are going to discuss in detail in the coming slides. Okay. Modern synthetic theory also addressed the relationship between broad changes of macroevolution as seen by certain paleontologists and microevolution of small, that means small changes as in living local populations. So Darwin could not explain what is that called the transition forms because paleontologists observed macroevolution. But so this modern synthetic theory, it will address the relationship between the broad changes of macroevolution and also the small changes that cause microevolution in the living local populations. There are certain forces which are driving the species to undergo evolutionary changes. These forces may be mutations, gene flow, genetic drift, natural selection, and certain reproductive isolations. Reproductive isolation. Okay. These forces are causing changes to genetic gene pool. You know, gene pool is the totality of genes of a population. If population is large, gene pool is receiving very less changes. If a population is small, then the gene pool will be affected even with a minor change in the population. Okay. There are certain basic factors of evolution. If any species want to evolve into a new species, the individuals of the species must possess these basic factors. Their body or their organization must have gene mutations, chromosomal mutations, genetic recombination, that means during meiosis certain recombinations occur, and these organisms must be subjected to natural selection, reproductive isolation. These are the basic factors that a species must possess to undergo evolution. Okay, friends, you are gradually understanding evolution does not occur by because of acquired characters or because of only the natural selection procedure, but several other ideas are important in understanding the process of evolution. And you can immediately notice the changes by following Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium will explain the actual allelic changes. The frequencies of alleles, when they are changing, we can immediately notice that a small evolutionary change is happening. We can also notice the direction in which the evolution is moving. Okay, so these are all the ideas of modern synthetic theory. The forces of evolution, what we are going to discuss, are mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. Let us discuss mutation. Mutation theory, the theory of mutations, was proposed by Hugo de Vries. Hugo de Vries, when he was observing his garden of Enothera lamarckiana, the evening primrose plants, all of a sudden he could notice that four different varieties of plants all of a sudden formed in his garden. Enothera nanella, Enothera zygus, Enothera brevistylis, and Enothera livifolia. These are the four new varieties he observed in his garden all of a sudden formed in one generation. And it is a sudden change. All of a sudden, Enothera nanella is very, very short. Enothera zygus is very large and very tall, very much tall. Enothera brevistylis is having different character of style. Enothera livifolia is having somewhat different texture of its leaf. All of a sudden, he noticed in his garden, four new varieties are formed. When tested whether those characters are showing inheritance, yes, they showed inheritance. So he declared or he proposed a theory that sometime a sudden change may happen. These sudden changes in the genetic material may bring, okay, some changes in the morphological characters or anatomical characters, and these sudden changes in the genetic material are termed as mutations. T.H. Morgan also studied about mutations in his experimental material Drosophila. But friends, Darwin also observed mutations. He named them as sports of nature or saltations. But what the big blunder Darwin made was he did not consider these mutations as the raw materials of evolution. Okay, he thought that the mutations will never be selected by nature because they are very, very big. They are quite uneven. So they are not selected according to Darwin, but that is a very big blunder. Actually, mutations are the raw materials of evolution. What is a mutation then? A sudden, random, and heritable change in DNA or genetic material is called mutation. It is a sudden change. But in what direction it is happening, we cannot expect. It's a random change everywhere or at any time it can happen, but it is heritable. So this change is passing to the next generation because the change is happening not in the somatic cell, but in the DNA, actually in the DNA part. Of course, mutations may occur in somatic cells also, but mutations definitely occur in the DNA, that means in the genetic material of the cell. Mutations occur time to time. They are not continuous. They are discontinuous. And mutations don't have any intermediate forms. Mutations once occur, they occur in full-fledged condition. There are no intermediate forms. And many times mutations can be reversible. So we receive so many mutations, and many mutations are not selected by nature. Okay, so the sudden heritable changes in DNA or genetic material are called mutations. You know very well, friends, DNA is the ultimate molecule, and it is responsible for our appearance, for internal anatomy or physiology or behavior, whatever we are behaving, whatever physiology that is going in our body, and what is the appearance of our body, are all due to the genetic material that is called DNA. When a change happens in DNA, definitely it can affect our appearance, it can affect our behavior, it can affect our physiology. So, a change in DNA can bring changes in all aspects of life. Okay, mutations are the ultimate sources of evolution. Say they are the raw materials of evolution, and it is the king's way of evolution, because mutation is major responsible for the evolution. What Darwin explained variations are actually are actually replaced in modern synthetic theory by the word mutation. Okay, so all variations may not be heritable, but a variation called mutation is heritable. Mutations are the raw materials of evolution, and mutations are the only way to create new alleles and new changes in our DNA. So very, very important force of evolution are mutations. Mutations are random. They can occur at any time, at anywhere, or in any way. And they can be beneficial, or they can be neutral, or they can be harmful. Mutations are three types. They may be beneficial, useful mutations, or the mutation doesn't affect anything, neutral mutation, or the mutation which is going to cause a disease, that is a harmful mutation. Mutations are broadly classified into three types: beneficial changes, neutral changes, or harmful changes. The very, very important idea that we need to understand is mutations do not supply what an organism needs. You see, for example, use theory as explained by Lamarck. Gradually a change happens in the body, that change will satisfy the need of the body. But that is not the case in this mutation. Mutations do not supply what the organism is actually needed. Mutations occur randomly. Whether a change is useful, then the organism or the species will accept that change. But when a species needs a particular change and that change happens because of mutation, there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee that mutation is going to bring so and so desirable change. So mutations do not supply what an organism needs actually. And not all mutations cause evolution. Say mutations are classified into two types. Mutations occur in the DNA of somatic cells, and mutations occur in the DNA of germ cells. Somatic mutations and germline mutations. Okay, somatic mutations will never be inherited, and our body, during our lifetime, our body suffers from those mutations if they are harmful. And the germline mutations, what occur in the germinal cells, are definitely carried to the next generation. They are inherited. Okay, so based on their selective value, adaptive value, they'll be given preference in evolution. Even the germline mutations sometimes do not affect. In what way they are not affecting? When a germline mutation occurs in non-coding portion of our say 98% of DNA is having non-coding portion. Okay, junk DNA is there. So when a mutation occurs in the non-coding portion, that mutation does not cause any effect because it is not at all coding any protein. When a mutation occurs in the protein coding area but doesn't alter the formation of amino acid at the end, will not show any effect. When a mutation occurs in that particular area, because of that mutation, the amino acid or the protein formation is affected, then only such mutations cause changes. They are considered as a very, very important mutations for evolution. So, when a mutation occurs in non-coding part, or when a mutation occurs in coding part but ends up not affecting the amino acid sequence, will not cause any change. Only those mutations that occur in the protein coding part or in certain areas which are affecting our metabolism, or which are bringing, the mutation brings some changes in our protein expression, then only such mutations are considered for evolution. Okay. A single mutation may cause phenotypic changes. You take, for example, DDT resistance in insects is a very simple single mutation. So, when a single mutation occurred, the insects are now tolerating, resisting, what is that called, DDT. That is why they are surviving. A single mutation making them survive under different difficult conditions. Okay. Sometimes what happens, a single mutation can bring death to the organisms. But those mutations are called lethal mutations. Sometimes a single mutation can develop a character which is useful for evolution, or sometimes a single mutation can bring death to the organism. Such mutations are called lethal mutations. Okay. The causes of mutations. Most mutations occur spontaneously during the meiosis. Spontaneously. But mutations are universal. They can occur at any time in any organism in any way. But mutations can be induced. There are induced mutations. Artificial mutations or induced mutations are there. Certain agents like colchicine, mustard gas, and certain ultraviolet radiation, X radiation, okay, certain drugs can cause mutations. Mutations may be spontaneous or universal, natural, or mutations can be induced. Okay. And most of the mutations that occur in our body will never, what is that called, fruitful actually. Well, will never come out because we have DNA repairing genes. The DNA repairing genes check all the time whether the DNA is mutated or not. If it is mutated, then it will repair and it will it will bring back its original status. That's why most of the mutations never come out. Okay, so before they can come out, they can be normalized by DNA repairing genes. But one thing we need to understand, that mutations are the very, very important forces that cause variations in gene pool. If all of a sudden a mutation occurs, the two alleles of a gene will become three alleles. So it will bring what is that called, allelic frequency disturbance. Mutations cause variations in gene pool, and mutations may be favorable, or mutations may be neutral, or mutations may be deleterious. Deleterious means harmful. Favorable mutations will increase the chance of survival to enhance the reproductive ability. A favorable mutation occurs, it will increase the chance of survival. As a result of that, when survival thing is increased, then definitely the reproductive ability, reproductive potential of that particular organism also increased. Favorable mutations are selected by nature. They are preserved by nature so that favorable mutations can accumulate because of natural selection. A majority of mutations have no significant effect. As DNA is having, I mentioned, as DNA is having repairing mechanisms to operate. Majority of mutations, before they can affect, they can be what is that called, repaired. Many organisms have mechanisms for eliminating somatic cell mutations. When a somatic cell gets mutated, it may become a self-altered cell or a cancerous cell. Such cancerous cells will be killed by natural killer cells, or the cancer cells, okay, carcinogenic cells, have their own mechanism of programmed cell death that is known as apoptosis. By that way, the somatic mutations can be kept under control. As I mentioned, mutations are subjected to natural selection. That means useful mutations are selected and the harmful mutations are discarded by nature. Okay? Small variations what Darwin used to explain his theory of natural selection, that is to be modified. Instead of using those small variations, we need to use mutations are very, very important factors or forces of evolution. So the small variations what Darwin used are now replaced by mutations in neo-Darwinism. What is the main difference between Darwinism and neo-Darwinism? Darwinism, small variations. Neo-Darwinism, sports. That means large mutations. So mutations are playing a very, very, very important role in bringing evolution, and they are the only source of creating a new variety, creating a new allele. Okay, friends, let us discuss the second force of evolution. The second force of evolution after mutation is the gene flow. Gene flow, the flow of genes from one population to another population. The movement of alleles from one population to another population is described as gene flow. Generally, any species, maybe no matter whether they may be plants or animals, they tend to live in small populations. Let us consider the animal populations. When animal populations are living in small populations, small aggregations or small populations, then an individual may move from one population to another population. And this movement we must consider, we must not consider as an individual is moving. So evolutionarily speaking, we have to consider the genes what are present in that individual are moving from one population to another population. If that individual which is migrating, it may be an immigration or emigration, an individual which is moving from one population to another population is bringing new alleles if it is having. Okay, the new alleles are added to one population, the recipient population, and the very important alleles are lost by the donor population. Okay, so because of losing, this is called a loss, a change may happen in the allelic frequency. Or because of gaining a new allele, this is called fixing or fixation, the allelic frequency of recipient population may be changed. Or else if gene flow doesn't occur, then also the small populations develop their own variations. That means their own mutations. In that way, they'll become totally different from each other. So gene flow can be considered in two ways. Gene flow can make loss of some important alleles, thereby altering allelic frequency and disturbing Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and creating a new species. Or gene flow will fix certain new alleles in one population, thereby altering the allelic frequency, disturbing the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and creating a new species if gene flow occurs. Or else if gene flow doesn't occur, the small populations develop their own, what is that called, their own changes or their own mutations. As the mutations are developing separately, individually in these two populations, they will become totally separated from one another. So when gene flow occurs, then some of the genes are moving from one population to another population so that the two populations will have some commonalities. So gene flow is affecting in two ways. Okay, gene flow will change the composition of gene pool. Gene flow will change the composition of gene pool, or gene flow will increase the variation of the two populations. Okay, the random introduction of alleles into the recipient population by immigration and the random removal of an allele from the donor population by emigration can affect the allelic frequencies in both the population. Okay, removal is called loss and addition is called fixation. Gene flow changes the composition of gene pool. Gene flow increases variation. And reduction, this is very important. Reduction or restriction of gene flow between two populations is essential for evolution, because when gene flow is restricted, the two small populations develop their own mutations and will become separate from one another. In many plants and animals, gene flow occur not only between the two subpopulations of the same species, but also occur between the different species, closely related different species. If gene flow occurs from one species to another species, sibling species, let us say very close related species, then because of this, a hybrid may be formed. Okay, a hybrid individual may be produced. Later, if the hybrid is breeding with its mother population, then a new gene is passed to the entire population, and this is known as introgression. Because of the formation of hybrid, how is hybrid formed? Between the two closely related species if genes are flowing. Okay, if reproduction occurs between the two closely related species, then hybrid can be formed. If hybrid becomes fertile and reproduces with its original population or mother population, then the hybrid genes will be fixed in the population, thereby altering the allelic frequencies. And this very important mechanism of evolution is called introgression. Okay, friends, today we discussed two forces of evolution in modern synthetic theory. They are a very, very important force of evolution, that is mutation, which is creating variation and creating new alleles. And the other idea, which was not explained at all by Darwin or not explained at all by Lamarck and another scientists, is gene flow. The flow of genes, fixation or loss, or the flow of what is that called, to prevent the gene flow, because restricting the gene flow can also create new changes. So gene flow is a very important force of evolution. Mutation is also a very important force of evolution. And in the next video lesson, in part 2, in continuation of this video lesson as part 2, we are going to discuss the Sewall-Wright effect or the genetic drift. And later in the third part of this video lesson, we are going to discuss natural selection. Okay, hope you have understood the ideas about mutation and migration. Migration means gene flow. Thank you, friends. Thank you for watching this video.